The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas frontier as Rebecca Martinez knelt beside her dying patient, pressing clean cloth against his fevered brow. She had no idea that in 3 hours, her world would shatter completely, and that the Apache warrior who would capture her possessed scars far deeper than any blade could inflict. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Martinez had inherited more than just her grandmother's healing touch. She'd inherited her stubborn refusal to abandon anyone in need. At 24, she served as the only medically trained person in the settlement of Cedar Hollow, a cluster of adobe buildings and wooden structures that clung to existence along the Brazos River. Her knowledge came not from formal schooling, which was impossible for a woman of mixed Mexican and Irish heritage in 1847 Texas, but from years spent learning ancient remedies from her abuela and practical medicine from Doc Harrison before he died of consumption the previous winter. Settlement existed in a precarious balance with the surrounding Apache territories. Most residents lived in constant fear, their rifles always within arm's reach, their horses saddled and ready for flight. Rebecca understood their terror, but she also understood something they didn't, that healing recognized no boundaries of race or creed. She had secretly treated Apache wounded before, during brief truces or chance encounters, earning her a reputation among some bands as a woman of medicine, who honored the sacred duty to preserve life. On this particular morning, Rebecca worked over Jacob Sullivan, a young homesteader who'd been gored by a wild boar while checking his trap lines. The wound was deep and already showing signs of infection despite her best efforts with willow bark tea and honey poultices. His wife, Margaret, sat nearby clutching their infant daughter, her eyes red from crying and sleepless nights. Rebecca mixed another batch of yarrow and golden seal paste, her movements precise despite her exhaustion. She'd been tending Jacob for 3 days straight, catching only scattered hours of sleep in the wooden chair beside his bed. The settlement's other families had offered help, but Rebecca knew that Jacob's survival depended on constant monitoring. One wrong turn, one fever spike left unattended, and Margaret would become another frontier widow. "The fever's breaking," Rebecca murmured, noting how Jacob's breathing had steadied and his skin felt cooler to the touch. "Margaret, try to get him to drink more of the willow bark tea when he wakes. Small sips, but keep it coming." Margaret nodded, managing a weak smile. "Rebecca, I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You've barely left his side." Rebecca gathered her supplies into the worn leather satchel her grandmother had passed down to her. "Just get him well, that's payment enough. I'll check on him again." This evening, she stepped out into the harsh Texas sun, squinting as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. Cedar Hollow bustled with its usual morning activity, children chasing chickens between the buildings, women hanging laundry on lines stretched between cottonwood trees, men discussing the best routes for hunting parties. The settlement had grown to nearly 40 families over the past 2 years, drawn by fertile soil along the river and the promise of land ownership. Rebecca made her way toward her own small cabin, built against the settlement's eastern wall. Her father had constructed it with thick adobe walls and a root cellar where she stored her medicinal supplies. The location offered privacy for her work while keeping her close, enough to respond quickly to medical emergencies. As she approached her door, she noticed her neighbor Emma Crawford hanging clothes with unusual urgency, glancing repeatedly toward the horizon. Emma's husband served as one of the settlement's unofficial scouts, and she often picked up on subtle signs of danger that others missed. "Emma, is everything all right?" Rebecca called out. Emma paused in her work, a damp shirt clutched in her hands. "Thomas came back from his morning ride looking spooked. Says he saw smoke signals to the northwest, but they weren't from any of the friendly bands we trade with. Different pattern, different meaning." Rebecca felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Smoke signals could mean many things: communication between hunting parties, warnings about natural disasters, or coordination for raids. The settlement had enjoyed relative peace for several months, but tensions throughout Texas remained high as more settlers pushed into traditional Apache lands. How far northwest? Rebecca asked. Maybe 10 miles. Could be nothing, but Thomas is meeting with the other men to discuss posting extra guards. Emma resumed hanging clothes with nervous energy. Just thought you should know, especially with you living so close to the perimeter. Rebecca thanked Emma and continued toward her cabin, her mind already shifting to practical preparations. If trouble was coming, she needed to secure her medical supplies and ensure her most critical patients could be moved quickly if necessary. Jacob Sullivan couldn't be transported in his current condition, which meant she might need to stay close to town rather than retreat to the hills as planned if raiders appeared. She unlocked her cabin door and stepped into the cool interior, breathing in the familiar sense of dried herbs and tinctures. Bundles of plants hung from the ceiling beams: purple echinacea, silvery sage, bright yellow calendula flowers. Glass jars lined wooden shelves filled with roots, seeds, and powdered medicine she'd prepared over months of careful work. This collection represented years of knowledge and preparation, and losing it would devastate not just her but everyone who depended on her healing skills. Rebecca began systematically packing her most essential supplies into 2 leather bags that could be carried on horseback if needed. Bandages, needle and thread for suturing, bottles of distilled spirits for cleaning wounds, packets of willow bark and feverfew, her grandmother's silver surgical instruments. She worked methodically, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind processed the morning's warning. The northwest direction concerned her more than Emma probably realized. That area contained several sacred Apache sites, including burial grounds and ceremonial locations that held deep spiritual significance. If settlers had inadvertently trespassed or disturbed those places, it could provoke serious retaliation. She'd learned about these sacred areas through careful conversations with Apache traders during peaceful encounters, always showing respect for their beliefs and traditions. A sharp knock interrupted her preparations. Rebecca opened the door to find Thomas Crawford, Emma's husband, standing with 2 other men from the settlement council. Their grim expressions confirmed her worst fears. "Rebecca, we need to talk," Thomas said without preamble. "We're organizing the families for potential evacuation, but we've got a problem. Jacob Sullivan can't be moved, and Margaret won't leave without him." Rebecca nodded slowly. "His condition has stabilized, but moving him now could reopen the wound or trigger a lapse. He needs at least another day of rest before travel would be safe." "That's what we figured," said Samuel Bennett, the settlement's unofficial leader. "We're asking if you'd be willing to stay with the Sullivan family if things go bad. The rest of us can move the other families to the caves upstream, but someone needs to look after Jacob." Rebecca considered the request carefully. Staying meant accepting significant personal risk, but abandoning a patient went against everything her grandmother had taught her about the sacred duty of healers. "I'll stay," she said finally, "but I want assurance that if fighting starts, someone will ride for help. Don't just assume we're lost." Samuel clasped her shoulder gratefully. "You have my word. We'll send riders to Fort Richardson and any other settlements within range. You're not expendable, Rebecca. None of us are." The men departed to continue their preparations, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts and fears. She finished packing her emergency supplies, then prepared a larger collection of medicines that could sustain her through an extended crisis. If she was going to stay and tend to Jacob, she needed resources for multiple patients and various types of injuries. As afternoon approached, Rebecca made rounds through the settlement, checking on her regular patients and ensuring everyone understood the evacuation plans. Old Martha Henderson needed help gathering her arthritis medicines. Young Billy Martinez required fresh bandages for a burn he'd suffered, helping his father with blacksmith work. and several women wanted advice about which medical supplies to prioritize if they could only carry essential items. Throughout these visits, Rebecca noticed the growing tension in Cedar Hollow. Men cleaned weapons with unusual attention to detail, women packed belongings with swift efficiency, and children picked up on the adult anxiety despite efforts to keep them calm. The settlement had survived previous scares, but something about today felt different, more urgent, more dangerous. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Rebecca returned to check on Jacob Sullivan one final time before dark. His condition continued improving, but he remained weak and pale from blood loss. Margaret sat beside his bed, spooning broth between his lips while their baby daughter slept in a makeshift crib nearby. "Any word on what's happening?" Margaret asked quietly. Rebecca shook her head. "Thomas and the others are still watching the horizon. Could be nothing, could be something serious. Either way, we'll know soon enough." She adjusted Jacob's bandages and checked his pulse, satisfied with his steady improvement. "Margaret, if trouble does come, I need you to follow my instructions exactly. No matter what you hear or see outside, your job is to keep Jacob calm and still. Panic could restart his bleeding, and we can't afford that." Margaret nodded solemnly. "What about little Sarah? Keep her close and quiet if possible. Babies sense their mother's fear, so try to stay as calm as you can manage." Rebecca squeezed Margaret's hand reassuringly. "We'll get through this together." As evening settled over Cedar Hollow, Rebecca positioned herself near the Sullivan cabin's single window where she could observe the settlement's perimeter while remaining close to her patient. The other families had already begun their evacuation, moving quietly toward the river caves with their most precious possessions loaded onto pack animals. Within an hour, the settlement would be nearly empty except for the Sullivan family and herself. Rebecca checked her medical supplies one more time, ensuring everything was within easy reach. Her hands moved automatically through familiar motions, but her mind dwelled on the approaching unknown. She'd treated Apache wounded before and found them to be people like any others, capable of both cruelty and kindness, driven by the same basic needs for survival, family, and dignity that motivated everyone on the frontier. But she also knew that desperation could transform anyone into something dangerous. If Apache raiders were indeed approaching Cedar Hollow, they would be men pushed to extremes by loss of land, resources, or loved ones. Such men might show no mercy to settlers they viewed as invaders, regardless of past kindnesses or medical ethics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The last traces of sunlight faded from the sky, leaving Cedar Hollow shrouded in darkness, broken only by flickering oil lamps in a few remaining windows. Rebecca extinguished her own lamp and allowed her eyes to adjust to the moonlight, knowing that darkness could either hide them from raiders or make them more vulnerable to surprise attack. Out in the distance, she heard the soft nickering of horses being led away from the settlement, carrying the evacuated families toward temporary safety. Soon, the only sounds would be wind through the cottonwood trees, the occasional call of night birds, and Jacob's steady breathing as he slowly healed from his injuries. Rebecca settled into her vigil, one hand resting on her medical bag and the other on the loaded rifle Samuel Bennett had insisted she keep nearby. She prayed that morning would come peacefully, bringing nothing more dangerous than another day of routine healing work in the Texas frontier. But deep in her heart, she sensed that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Attack came with the gray light of dawn, swift and silent as death itself. Rebecca jerked awake in her chair beside Jacob's bed, instantly alert as war cries shattered the morning calm. Through the window, she glimpsed painted figures moving between the empty buildings of Cedar Hollow, their movements coordinated and purposeful. "Margaret, wake up but don't make a sound," Rebecca whispered urgently. Margaret's eyes snapped open, immediately understanding the gravity of their situation. Baby Sarah stirred but remained mercifully quiet. Rebecca peered through a gap in the wooden shutters, counting at least 8 Apache warriors methodically searching the abandoned buildings. They moved with practiced efficiency, looking for supplies, weapons, or hidden settlers. Their war paint gleamed in the dawn, light bold stripes of red and black across faces hardened by years of conflict. One warrior stood apart from the others, taller and broader than his companions. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the distinctive scarring that covered the left side of his face and neck, twisting his features into a permanent mask of fury. He gestured sharply to the other raiders, directing their search with the authority of a war chief. Jacob stirred on his bed, beginning to mumble incoherently as consciousness returned. Rebecca quickly placed her hand over his mouth, her eyes pleading with Margaret to keep him quiet. The slightest sound could bring the raiders directly to their hiding place. The scarred warrior moved closer to their cabin, his keen eyes scanning for any sign of life. Rebecca held her breath as his shadow passed across their window. He paused, seeming to sense something, then continued toward the next building. For nearly an hour, the raiders continued their systematic search. They gathered abandoned tools, food supplies, and anything else of value, loading their finds onto stolen horses from the settlement's corral. Rebecca began to hope they might complete their raid and depart without discovering the Sullivan family's presence. That hope shattered when baby Sarah began to cry. Margaret tried desperately to quiet her daughter, but the infant's hungry wails echoed clearly in the morning air. Within seconds, heavy footsteps approached their door. Rebecca grabbed her rifle, knowing that resistance was futile but unable to surrender without trying to protect her patients. The door exploded inward as the scarred warrior kicked it open. He filled the doorway like an avenging spirit, his damaged face twisted into an expression of cold calculation. His eyes swept the cabin's interior, taking in Rebecca with her weapon, Margaret clutching her baby, and Jacob lying helpless on his bed. "Put down the gun," he commanded in heavily accented English. His voice carried the rasp of old throat injuries, probably sustained during the same violence that had scarred his face. Rebecca kept the rifle aimed at his chest, though her hands trembled slightly. "We have wounded here. A man who cannot be moved. Let us be, and will cause you no trouble." The warrior's scarred mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "You are in no position to make bargains, white woman. Lower your weapon, or I will take it from your corpse." Behind him, other raiders appeared in the doorway, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. Rebecca realized that any attempt at resistance would only result in Margaret and the baby being harmed along with herself. Slowly, she lowered the rifle and set it aside. The scarred warrior stepped into the cabin, his eyes immediately drawn to Jacob's bandaged wounds. "You are a healer," he stated rather than asked. "I am," Rebecca replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "And my patient needs continued care if he's to live." The warrior studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "Cale Crow Feather," he said finally, touching his chest. "War chief of the Red Canyon Band." Rebecca had heard that name whispered in fearful tones around frontier settlements. Cale Crow Feather was said to be one of the most ruthless Apache raiders, a man who showed no mercy to settlers and who had sworn vengeance against all whites for some terrible loss. The scars covering his face and neck suddenly took on new meaning. These were not just wounds from battle, but marks of survival from some horrific ordeal. "Rebecca Martinez," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And these are the Sullivan family. They've done nothing to harm your people." Cale's expression hardened. Her surname, Martinez, Spanish blood mixed with white. "Your people came first to steal our lands, then the Americans followed. All thieves deserve the same fate." He barked orders in Apache to his warriors, and 2 of them moved forward to seize Rebecca's arms. She didn't resist, knowing that cooperation offered the only chance of survival for Margaret and the baby. "Please," Margaret whispered, clutching Sarah tighter. "Don't take her. My husband will die without her care." Cale glanced at Jacob's pale face and labored breathing, then back at Rebecca. "Your man is already dying. The healer comes with us. She has value. You and the child will live if you stay silent about our direction." Rebecca realized with growing horror that she was being taken as a captive, probably to be sold as a slave to Mexican traders or other Apache bands. Such transactions were common along the frontier, where human beings became currency in a brutal economy of survival and revenge. "My medical supplies," she said quickly. "I'll need them if you expect me to provide healing." Cale nodded curtly to one of his men, who gathered Rebecca's leather bags and threw them over his shoulder. Within minutes, they had bound her hands with rawhide strips and led her outside to where the other raiders waited with their stolen horses and plunder. Rebecca was lifted onto a paint horse behind one of the younger warriors, her bound hands, making it difficult to maintain her balance. As the raiding party prepared to depart, she caught one final glimpse of Margaret's terrified face in the cabin doorway. The raiders rode hard toward the northwest, following game trails and creek beds. That would make tracking difficult for any pursuit. Rebecca bounced uncomfortably on the horse's back, her medical training allowing her to note details that might prove useful later: the direction of travel, the number of warriors, their apparent destination based on the sun's position. Cale Crowfeather rode at the front of the group, his scarred profile stark against the morning sky. Even from behind, Rebecca could see the careful way he held his left shoulder, as if old injuries still caused him pain. Her healer's instincts automatically cataloged visible signs of past trauma: the stiffness in his movements, the protective way he favored certain positions, the rasp in his voice that suggested throat damage. They rode through increasingly rugged terrain as the day progressed, leaving the settled river valleys behind for rocky hills covered with scrub oak and cedar. This was Apache country, where white settlers rarely ventured and where pursuit would be nearly impossible for inexperienced trackers. During a brief rest stop beside a hidden spring, Rebecca observed the interactions between Cale and his warriors. They clearly respected and feared him, responding immediately to his commands while maintaining careful distance from his volatile temper. Several times she noticed younger warriors glancing at his scars with expressions of awe and uncertainty, as if the marks represented both his strength and his unpredictability. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the raiding party crested a ridge and began descending toward a hidden canyon. Below them, Rebecca could see the smoke of cooking fires and the movement of people among scattered wickiups and brush shelters. This was the Red Canyon Band stronghold, positioned in terrain that offered natural defenses against attack while providing access to water and game. The arrival of the raiding party caused immediate excitement in the camp. Women and children emerged from their shelters to greet the returning warriors and examine the captured goods. Rebecca felt dozens of curious and hostile stares fixed upon her as she was pulled down from the horse and forced to stand in the center of the gathering crowd. Cale dismounted and approached her, his scarred face impassive. "You will tend our sick and wounded," he announced loudly enough for the entire camp to hear. "Prove your value as a healer, and you will be fed and sheltered. Fail us, and you will be sold to the Comancheros before the next full moon." Rebecca straightened her shoulders, refusing to show the fear that coursed through her veins. "I'll need my supplies returned, and clean water for washing. I cannot heal anyone under unsanitary conditions." A murmur of surprise rippled through the watching crowd at her bold response. Several warriors shifted their hands toward their weapons, but Cale raised a hand to stop them. Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. "Bold words from a captive," he said quietly. "We shall see if your skills match your courage, healer woman." Rebecca's first test came within hours of her arrival. An elderly, Apache woman named Ayana approached her with trembling hands, gesturing frantically toward a wickiup where muffled cries of pain echoed in the evening air. Inside, Rebecca found a young warrior writhing on a buffalo hide, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle from a hunting accident. The bone had broken clean through the skin, creating a compound fracture that threatened both the man's leg and his life if infection set in. Blood soaked the makeshift bandages someone had applied, and the warrior's fever-bright eyes showed he was already fighting the early stages of shock. Rebecca knelt beside him, her bound hands making examination difficult. "I need these ropes cut if you expect me to help him," she said firmly to the crowd of Apache who had gathered to watch Cale Crow Feather push through the group, his scarred face skeptical. "You could use freedom to escape." "Where would I run in the middle of Apache territory?" Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. "This man will lose his leg or die if I can't work properly. Is your pride worth his life?" Something shifted in Cale's expression at her direct challenge. He drew his knife and sliced through the rawhide. Bonds freeing her hands but remaining close enough to stop any sudden movements. Rebecca immediately went to work, her training taking over despite the hostile environment. She cleaned her hands with water from a clay pot, then carefully examined the fracture site. The bone fragments would need to be aligned and held in place while the tissue healed, a delicate procedure, requiring steady hands and precise movements. "I need clean cloth for bandages, something to bite down on for the pain, and several straight pieces of wood for splints," she instructed, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. To her surprise, the materials appeared quickly. Apache women brought strips of soft leather and cotton cloth obtained from previous raids, while men provided carved wooden splints that showed considerable craftsmanship. Rebecca realized these people had their own healing traditions and understood the importance of proper tools. Working by firelight, Rebecca began the careful process of setting the broken bone. The young warrior, she learned his name was Nalnish, gritted, his teeth against a leather bit as she manipulated the bone fragments back into alignment. Sweat beaded on both their faces as she worked, his from pain and hers from concentration. Watching Apache observed in complete silence, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. Rebecca felt the weight of their scrutiny, knowing that her reputation and possibly her life depended on the success of this treatment. One mistake, one sign of incompetence, and Cale might decide she had no value as a captive. After what felt like hours, Rebecca finished splinting the leg and wrapping it securely. Nalnish had passed out from pain during the procedure, which actually made her work easier. His breathing remained steady and the bleeding had stopped completely. "He'll need to stay off that leg for at least 6 weeks, Rebecca explained to the gathered crowd. "The bone must heal completely before he puts weight on it, or it will break again and never mend properly." An older man who appeared to be the camp's medicine man approached and examined her work with professional interest. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Cale, gesturing at the splint and nodding approvingly. Cale's scarred features remained impassive, but Rebecca caught a flicker of something, perhaps surprise or grudging respect in his dark eyes. "Chato says your work is skillful," he translated. He has seen white doctors who knew less about setting bones. Over the following days, Rebecca found herself treating a variety of ailments and injuries among the Apache band. A child with a persistent cough that responded well to wild cherry bark tea. An elderly woman whose arthritis eased under applications of heated stones and willow bark poultices. A warrior whose old arrow wound had become infected, requiring careful cleaning and herbal antiseptics. Each successful treatment elevated her status within the camp, though she remained under constant guard. The Apache began to seek her out for minor complaints, and some of the women started showing her local plants with medicinal properties she'd never encountered before. During these interactions, Rebecca observed Cale Crow Feather from a distance. The war chief maintained strict discipline in the camp, settling disputes with swift justice and organizing hunting parties with military precision. But she noticed he avoided situations where his scars might be prominently displayed, turning his damaged left side away from others during conversations. More intriguingly, she began to observe signs of chronic pain in his movements. The way he favored his left arm during physical tasks, the careful rotation of his neck when looking over his shoulder, the slight limp that became more pronounced late in the day when fatigue set in. Whatever had caused his visible scars had inflicted deeper injuries that continued to torment him. On her 5th day in the camp, Rebecca was treating a pregnant woman with morning sickness when commotion erupted near Cale's wickiup. Angry voices rose in heated argument, and she glimpsed several warriors gesturing aggressively at their leader. The discussion grew so intense that other camp members stopped their activities to listen. Ayana, who had become Rebecca's unofficial interpreter, leaned close to whisper a translation. They argue about a raid on Fort Richardson. Some warriors say attack wagon train instead. Cale says no, too dangerous with soldiers nearby. Rebecca's blood chilled at the mention of Fort Richardson. That was where the evacuated families from Cedar Hollow would have fled for protection. If Cale's war party attacked the fort, innocent settlers including Margaret Sullivan and her baby could be caught in the violence. The argument continued for nearly an hour before the dissenting warriors stalked away from Cale's wickiup, their faces dark with frustration. Rebecca realized she had witnessed a serious challenge to the war chief's authority, one that could split the band and lead to even more dangerous raids if Cale lost control. That evening, as Rebecca organized her medical supplies by firelight, she was startled by the appearance of Cale's shadow across her work area. He stood silently for several moments, his scarred features unreadable in the flickering light. "Your people at the fort," he said finally. "They are safe for now. But my warriors grow restless. They want blood and glory, not the slow profit of trading captives." Rebecca looked up from her work, meeting his gaze directly. "Why are you telling me this?" Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke quietly, his voice carrying a weight of old pain. "Because you heal without asking if the patient deserves it. You set Nalnish's leg, knowing he would use it to raid your people again. That is unusual. Healing is not about judgment." Rebecca replied simply, "Pain is pain, regardless of who suffers it." Something flickered across Cale's scarred features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had forgotten. He stood silently for another long moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness without another word. Rebecca continued organizing her supplies, but her mind raced with the implications of their brief conversation. The war chief who had captured her was far more complex than she had initially believed, and the pain that drove his hatred might be deeper than any physical wound she had yet encountered. As the camp settled into sleep around her, Rebecca found herself wondering about the terrible events that had left Cale Crow Feather so thoroughly scarred, and whether her healing skills might somehow reach wounds that had never properly mended. Crisis came at dawn on Rebecca's 10th day in the camp. She woke to the sound of horses thundering into the canyon, their riders shouting urgent warnings in Apache. Through the entrance of her guarded wickiup, she watched as Cale emerged from his shelter, his face grim as he listened to the scout's rapid report. Ayana hurried over, her weathered features tight with worry. "Soldiers come," she whispered in broken English. 2 days behind, maybe less. "Someone from your settlement told them where we hide." Rebecca felt her stomach clench with dread. The evacuation to Fort Richardson had clearly succeeded, but now the military was responding with a punitive expedition. She could imagine the scene: angry settlers demanding action, officers planning an assault on the Red Canyon stronghold, and caught in the middle, the Apache families who had shown her unexpected kindness. Cale strode through the camp issuing rapid orders. Warriors began breaking down wickiups and packing essential supplies onto travois, while women gathered children and elderly family members for rapid evacuation. The efficient organization spoke to years of experience fleeing military pursuit. But as Rebecca watched the preparations, she noticed something troubling. Several of the younger warriors weren't participating in the evacuation efforts. Instead, they clustered around Tokala, the hot-headed sub-chief who had argued with Kale about raiding strategy. Their animated gestures and defiant expressions suggested they were planning something reckless. "Ayana," Rebecca called softly, "what are those men discussing?" The elderly woman followed her gaze and frowned deeply. "Tokala says no more running. Says we fight soldiers in a canyon, make trap, kill them all and take their weapons." Rebecca's blood ran cold. A military expedition would consist of experienced cavalry soldiers armed with modern rifles and possibly artillery. Fighting them in the confined space of the canyon would be suicidal for the Apache, resulting in a massacre that would destroy the entire band. She watched as the argument between Tokala and Kale escalated into a shouting match near the center of camp. Other warriors began choosing sides. Their loyalties split between their war chief's cautious leadership and the younger man's appeal to violent pride. The fragile unity of the band was fracturing at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, Tokala pushed Kale hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The war chief's hand dropped to his knife handle, his scarred face twisting with rage. For a heartbeat, Rebecca thought she was about to witness a fight to the death between the two Apache leaders. Instead, Kale straightened slowly and spoke in a voice so cold it carried clearly across the camp, despite its quietness. Every warrior within hearing distance fell silent, recognizing the deadly menace in their chief's tone. Tokala's defiant expression wavered as Kale continued speaking, his words apparently describing in vivid detail what would happen to anyone who challenged his authority during a crisis. The confrontation ended with Tokala backing down, but Rebecca could see the damage was done. Trust had been broken, and the seeds of future rebellion had been planted. Kale's leadership was no longer absolute, and that weakness could prove fatal for everyone in the camp. As the evacuation continued, Rebecca found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. Chato, the elderly medicine man, approached her with urgent gestures toward a wickiup at the far end of camp. Inside, she discovered a young mother named Isia writhing in the throes of difficult labor, her cries of pain muffled by the leather bit clenched between her teeth. A quick examination revealed a breech presentation. The baby was positioned incorrectly for birth, creating a potentially fatal situation for both mother and child. Under normal circumstances, Rebecca would need hours of careful work to safely deliver the infant. But with soldiers approaching and the camp preparing for immediate evacuation, time was a luxury they didn't possess. "How long has she been in labor?" Rebecca asked Chato through gestures and broken Spanish phrases. "Since yesterday sunset," he replied in accented English. "Baby will not come. She grows weak." Rebecca knelt beside Isia, her mind racing through possible solutions. The woman's husband knelt on the other side of the bedding, his young face etched with terror at the possibility of losing both wife and unborn child. Around them, the sounds of evacuation continued: horses being loaded, children crying, adults calling urgent instructions to one another. "I need clean water, soft cloth, and privacy," Rebecca instructed Chato. "And someone must tell Kale that we cannot move this woman until the baby is born safely." Chato's eyes widened with alarm. "War Chief will not wait. Soldiers come too close. Then he'll have to decide what matters more, saving one life or potentially sacrificing two." Rebecca began preparing for the delivery, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "This baby can be saved, but only if I have time to work." Word of the situation reached Kale within minutes. He appeared in the wickiup entrance like an avenging spirit, his scarred features dark with fury at this new complication. "We leave now," he announced flatly. The woman comes or stays, but we will not all die for one birth." Rebecca didn't look up from her patient as she replied, "The baby is breech. Moving her now will kill them both. Give me 2 hours, and I can save them." 2 hours we do not have, Cale snapped. "Soldiers will reach the canyon mouth by midday. Then fight them," Rebecca said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. "You're Apache. This is your land, your stronghold. Make them pay for every foot of ground." Cale's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features at her suggestion. "You counsel me to make war on your own people?" Rebecca looked down at Isaiah, whose pain-filled eyes pleaded silently for help. "I counsel you to protect your family. Isn't that what any leader would do?" For a long moment, the war chief stared at her with an unreadable expression. Around them, the evacuation continued with increasing urgency as scouts reported the approaching cavalry getting closer. Finally, Cale spoke in rapid Apache to several nearby warriors, issuing what sounded like defensive preparations. "You have until the sun reaches mid-sky," he told Rebecca grimly. "After that, we fight or flee, but we do not wait." Rebecca nodded and turned her full attention to the delivery. Working with Chato's assistance, she began the delicate process of manually repositioning the infant within the birth canal. Asia's screams of pain echoed through the wickiup as Rebecca's hands guided the baby into the correct presentation for birth. Outside, she could hear the sounds of warriors taking defensive positions around the canyon rim. Cale was apparently choosing to fight rather than abandon Isaiah, though Rebecca suspected his decision had more to do with wounded pride than compassion for his people. The baby's head finally emerged after nearly an hour of careful manipulation. Rebecca quickly cleared the infant's airway and guided the shoulders through the birth canal, her movements precise despite the sweat that stung her eyes. With a final push from the exhausted mother, the baby slipped free into Rebecca's waiting hands. The infant was small but healthy, his lusty cries announcing his successful entry into a world at war. Rebecca quickly cleaned him and placed him in his mother's arms, then turned her attention to controlling Isaiah's bleeding and ensuring no complications followed the difficult birth. "A son," Chato announced with obvious joy, his weathered face creasing into a broad smile. "Strong and whole." As Rebecca finished her post-delivery care, the sound of gunfire erupted from the canyon rim above them. The cavalry had arrived, and Cale's warriors were making their first stand against the military assault. The battle for Red Canyon had begun. With Rebecca caught in the middle between two forces that viewed each other as mortal enemies, she looked down at the newborn infant nursing peacefully in his mother's arms, oblivious to the violence raging around him. At that moment, Rebecca realized that her healing work had become something more than medical treatment. It had become an act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to destroy everything pure and innocent. The war cries of Apache warriors mixed with the sharp crack of military rifles as the fight intensified above them. Rebecca gathered her medical supplies, knowing that regardless of who emerged victorious, there would be wounded requiring her care. The battle would test not only Cale's leadership, but also the deeper question of whether healing could survive. In a world consumed by vengeance and hatred, the battle raged for 3 hours. Before the first wounded warrior stumbled into the medical shelter Rebecca had established near the canyon's protected heart. Blood streamed from a gash across his forehead where a cavalry saber had nearly claimed his life, and his left arm hung useless from a bullet wound that had shattered the bone near his shoulder. Rebecca worked without pause, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned wounds, applied pressure bandages, and administered what pain relief her limited supplies could provide. The steady stream of injured Apache warriors told the story of a fierce but costly defense. Cale's men were holding the canyon mouth, but at a terrible price. Chato assisted her with grim determination, his knowledge of Apache healing traditions complementing her frontier medical training. Together they managed to save lives that would have been lost to blood loss or infection, though Rebecca's supply of bandages and antiseptic herbs dwindled alarmingly with each new patient dot as afternoon shadows lengthened across the canyon floor. A commotion near the main trail announced the arrival of more casualties. Rebecca looked up from stitching a warrior's scalp wound to see 4 men carrying a makeshift stretcher constructed from war lances and a buffalo hide. The figure lying motionless upon it made her blood freeze. Cale Crow Feather lay unconscious, his scarred face pale beneath streaks of blood and dirt. A cavalry bullet had torn through his left shoulder, the same side where his mysterious old injuries had left him vulnerable. Worse still, a saber cut across his ribs had opened a wound deep enough to expose bone, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that suggested internal damage. "Bring him here immediately," Rebecca commanded, clearing space on her makeshift operating table. The warriors carrying Cale obeyed without question, their faces etched with desperate concern for their fallen leader. Rebecca's hands moved swiftly over Cale's body, assessing the extent of his injuries with professional detachment. Despite the emotional turmoil churning in her chest, the shoulder wound was serious but manageable. The bullet had passed through muscle without striking major arteries. The saber cut required immediate attention to prevent infection, but it was the internal injuries that concerned her most. "How long has he been unconscious?" she asked the warriors who had brought him in. "Since the cavalry charge broke through our first line," replied one man whose own arm bore a crude bandage. "He was fighting 3 soldiers when their captain struck him down. Tokala pulled him back, but the damage was already done." Rebecca noted with surprise that Tokala, Cale's rival for leadership, had risked his own life to save the war chief. He had challenged. The crisis had apparently restored unity to the Apache band, at least temporarily. Working by flicker and torchlight, Rebecca began the delicate process of cleaning and suturing Cale's wounds. His unconscious state made the work easier in some ways, allowing her to probe for internal damage without causing additional pain. But his shallow breathing and weak pulse suggested trauma beyond what she could see. As she worked, Rebecca found herself studying the extensive scarring that covered the left side of Cale's face and neck. Up close, she could see that these were burn marks, not from fire, but from some caustic substance that had eaten deep into his flesh. The pattern suggested deliberate torture rather than accidental injury, and the precision of the scars spoke to prolonged suffering inflicted by human hands. Her grandmother had told her stories about Apache warriors captured by Mexican slavers, men who endured unspeakable torments before either escaping or dying under their captors' cruelty. Looking at Cale's scars, Rebecca realized she was seeing the permanent evidence of such an ordeal, wounds that had healed physically but left psychological damage that might never fully mend. "Ayana," she called softly to the elderly woman who had been helping tend the wounded. "What happened to Cale's face? These scars, they're very old." Ayana's expression grew troubled, and she glanced around nervously before responding in hushed tones. "Mexican slavers took him when he was a young warrior. Kept him chained for many months, used him for sport. Burns came from heated iron. They marked him like cattle." Rebecca's stomach clenched with horror at the mental image. How did he escape? Killed 3 guards with broken chain, walked 200 miles through the desert to reach home. But he was changed, harder, angrier. Wife could not bear to look at his scars, took their children, and left for a different band. That is when Cale became war chief, when hatred consumes his heart. The revelation cast Cale's violence in a different light. His raids against settlers and Mexican traders weren't just territorial disputes. They were acts of vengeance against a world that had brutalized him beyond imagination. The scars on his face marked him as a survivor, but they also branded him as a man whose capacity for trust had been burned away. Along with his flesh, Rebecca continued working over his unconscious form, her hands gentle despite the urgency of his condition. She cleaned the saber wound with painstaking care, removing debris and damaged tissue before beginning the long process of suturing the deep gash. Each stitch required precise placement to prevent infection while allowing proper healing. As she worked, sounds from the battle above began to change. The steady crack of rifle fire gave way to intermittent skirmishes, suggesting the fighting was winding down. Whether through a patchy victory or tactical withdrawal, the immediate crisis seemed to be passing. Tokala appeared in the medical shelter's entrance, his war paint streaked with sweat and blood from multiple minor wounds. His eyes immediately fixed on Cale's still form, and Rebecca was surprised to see genuine concern rather than opportunistic calculation in the younger man's expression. "Will he live?" Tokala asked bluntly. Rebecca paused in her stitching to check Cale's pulse and breathing. Again, both had strengthened slightly during her treatment, though he remained deeply unconscious. "The wounds are serious but not necessarily fatal if infection doesn't set in. He needs rest, proper nutrition, and careful monitoring for the next several days. The soldiers have withdrawn to the canyon mouth," Tokala reported. "They lost too many men to press the attack, but they will not leave. They plan to starve us out or wait for reinforcements." Rebecca absorbed this information while continuing her work on Cale's injuries. A siege meant the medical crisis would only worsen. Limited supplies, poor sanitation, and the stress of prolonged danger would create ideal conditions for disease and infection to spread through the camp. "How many wounded do we have in total?" she asked. 12 men with serious injuries, 6 more with minor wounds, 3 dead. Tokala's voice carried the weight of command decisions he had been forced to make in Cale's absence. "Can you keep them alive until our war chief recovers?" Rebecca looked around the crude medical shelter at the wounded warriors lying on buffalo hides and woven mats. Most were young men with families depending on their survival, fathers and brothers whose deaths would devastate the community beyond the immediate military loss. Her dwindling medical supplies represented the thin line between life and death. "For all of them, I'll need more clean cloth for bandages, fresh water brought regularly, and someone to help me move the most seriously injured to a cleaner shelter," she said finally. "And if anyone in the camp knows herbal remedies for infection and fever, I need to speak with them immediately." Tokala nodded and began issuing orders to nearby warriors. As he organized the medical support Rebecca required, she noticed how naturally the other Apache deferred to his authority. Cale's unconsciousness had created a leadership vacuum, but Tokala seemed to be filling it with competent decision-making rather than the reckless aggression he had displayed earlier. Rebecca returned her attention to Cale's still form, applying the final stitches to his saber wound. His breathing had stabilized, and some color was returning to his scarred features. Most importantly, his pulse had grown stronger and more regular, suggesting his body was beginning to recover from the trauma. As she bandaged his wounds with her remaining clean cloth, Rebecca found herself wondering about the man beneath the scars and the reputation for ruthless violence. Seeing him vulnerable and unconscious, she could glimpse traces of who he might have been before torture and loss had hardened him into an instrument of vengeance. The question that haunted her was whether healing his physical wounds might somehow reach the deeper injuries that had transformed a young Apache warrior into the feared war chief known throughout Texas as Cale Crow Feather. In saving his life, was she preserving a valuable human soul, or merely ensuring that more innocent people would die under his leadership? Outside the medical shelter, night settled over the besieged canyon while the standoff with the cavalry continued. Rebecca kept vigil over her patients, particularly watching for any sign that Cale might be awakening from his dangerous unconsciousness. The fate of the entire Apache band might well depend on his recovery and on what kind of man emerged from his brush with death. Cale awakened on the 3rd night of the siege, his eyes opening suddenly in the dim firelight as if emerging from a violent dream. Rebecca, who had been dozing in a chair beside his makeshift bed, startled at his sharp intake of breath and the way his hand immediately reached for a weapon that wasn't there. "Don't move," she said quietly, placing a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "You've lost a lot of blood, and your wounds are still healing." Cale's dark eyes focused on her face. With difficulty, confusion flickering across his scarred features as memory slowly returned. "The battle... my warriors... alive, most of them. Tokala is leading the defense while you recover." Rebecca reached for a water gourd and helped him drink small sips. "The cavalry pulled back after you were wounded, but they're still blocking the canyon entrance. We're under siege." Cale struggled to sit up despite her protests, grimacing as the movement pulled at his stitched wounds. His gaze swept the medical shelter, taking in the other wounded warriors and the makeshift conditions under which Rebecca had been working. "How long have I been unconscious?" 3 days. "You nearly died from blood loss." Rebecca's voice carried a mixture of professional concern and something deeper relief that he had survived when the outcome had been uncertain for so long. "Your shoulder will heal completely, but the saber wound was more serious. You need to rest if you want to avoid permanent damage." Cale's hand moved instinctively to the bandages covering his ribs, probing gently at the extent of his injuries. "You could have let me die," he observed quietly. "Your army friends would consider it justice." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I'm a healer, not a judge. Besides, those soldiers aren't my friends. They're here to kill everyone in this canyon, including women and children who never harmed anyone." Something shifted in Cale's expression at her words, surprise replacing the suspicion that had initially greeted his awakening. He studied her face intently, as if searching for deception or hidden motives behind her care. "Ayana told me about your scars," Rebecca said softly, deciding that honesty might reach him more effectively than evasion. "About what the Mexican slavers did to you. I'm sorry you endured such suffering." Cale's features hardened instantly, the vulnerable moment vanishing behind a mask of controlled fury. "Pity from my captor? How generous!" His voice carried the bitter rasp that marked his old throat injuries. But beneath the sarcasm, Rebecca detected something else, shame perhaps, or the pain of memories he preferred to keep buried. "Not pity," Rebecca corrected firmly. "Understanding. Trauma like that changes a person, leaves wounds that never fully heal. I've seen it before in people who survive terrible ordeals." Cale was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the shelter's walls. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its defensive edge. "They kept me chained in a mine shaft for 8 months. Fed me scraps like a dog, used heated irons to mark their ownership. Said they were training me to be sold as a worker in the silver mines of Mexico." Rebecca listened without comment, recognizing the cathartic need to speak truths that had been locked away for years. Healers learned to become repositories for pain that patients couldn't carry alone. "My wife saw these scars when I finally returned home," Cale continued, touching his damaged face unconsciously. "She said I had become a monster, that she couldn't bear to look at what they had made of me. She took our children to her brother's band, said they would be safer without a father who carried so much darkness." The admission hung between them like a physical presence, heavy with years of accumulated grief and rage. Rebecca understood now why Cale had become such a ruthless war chief. His capacity for normal human connection had been severed along with his flesh, leaving only the raw need for vengeance to fill the void. "Darkness doesn't have to be permanent," Rebecca said gently. "I've seen people heal from wounds that seemed impossible to survive, not just the body, but the spirit too." Cale's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Look around you, healer woman. I am trapped in a canyon with soldiers waiting to kill us all. My warriors follow me because they fear me, not because they love me. My own family fled from the sight of my face. What kind of healing could possibly reach such ruin?" Before Rebecca could respond, urgent voices outside the shelter announced Tokala's arrival. The younger war chief ducked through the entrance, his face grim with news that would clearly complicate their already desperate situation. "Kale, you're awake. Good, we have decisions to make." Tokala's manner showed respect for his recovering leader while maintaining the authority he had assumed. During the crisis, the soldiers received reinforcements this morning. 2 more companies of cavalry, plus a mountain howitzer they're positioning to shell the canyon. Kale absorbed this information with apparent calm, though Rebecca could see the tension that coiled through his body at the news. Artillery would make their defensive positions untenable, turning the natural fortress of Red Canyon into a death trap. "Options?" Kale asked tersely. "Surrender and face hanging, fight and die gloriously, or attempt to break through their lines under cover of darkness." Tokala's voice carried no optimism about any of these choices. The women and children could not survive a running battle, and the wounded cannot be moved quickly enough to avoid capture. Rebecca found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to intervene. There might be another possibility. What if I approached the cavalry commander under a flag of truce? As a white woman, they might listen to terms for safe passage. Both Apache men stared at her with identical expressions of disbelief. The suggestion clearly struck them as either incredibly brave or completely insane. "You would do this?" Kale asked quietly. "Risk your life to save people who captured you as a slave?" Rebecca considered the question seriously, examining her own motivations with the honesty that healing work demanded. These people have families, dreams, hopes for the future. The children playing in this canyon yesterday are the same as children anywhere innocent of their parents' conflicts. I can't stand by and watch them die if there's any chance of preventing it. Kale struggled to his feet despite Rebecca's protests, swaying slightly as blood rushed from his head. He steadied himself against a wooden support post, his scarred face thoughtful as he processed her offer. "The army will demand unconditional surrender," he said finally. "They want to make an example that will discourage other bands from raiding. Even if they spare the women and children, they will hang every warrior as a warning to others. Then we negotiate something else," Rebecca replied with more confidence than she felt. "Exile instead of execution, perhaps. Relocation to a reservation. In exchange for ending the raids. There has to be some middle ground between total victory and complete destruction." Tokala shook his head skeptically. "White soldiers do not negotiate with Apache. They see us as animals to be exterminated, not people deserving of mercy." "Maybe," Rebecca acknowledged. "But what's the alternative? Fight until everyone dies or surrender and face hanging anyway? At least negotiation offers some possibility of survival." Kale studied her face intently, and Rebecca sensed he was weighing more than just military tactics. Something in his expression suggested he was measuring her character, testing whether her offer came from genuine compassion or hidden self-interest. "If you do this thing," he said slowly, "and the soldiers refuse to negotiate, they may decide to keep you and use artillery to finish us regardless. You could end up watching everyone here die while being powerless to help." Rebecca nodded, having already considered that possibility. "I understand the risks, but someone has to try. Too many people will die otherwise, Apache and soldiers both." The shelter fell silent except for the distant sounds of military activity beyond the canyon mouth. Rebecca could almost see the thoughts racing behind Kale's dark eyes as he calculated odds, considered alternatives, and perhaps allowed himself to hope that mercy might still exist in a world that had shown him precious little. Finally, he spoke with the authority of a war chief, making a decision that would affect every life under his protection. "We will try your negotiation, healer woman. But if the soldiers refuse reasonable terms, we fight. I will not lead my people into captivity to face slow death on a reservation." Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and terror at his acceptance. She had volunteered for a mission that could save lives or doom them all, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Everything would depend on her ability to convince hardened cavalry officers that Apache lives had value worth preserving. As Tokala departed to prepare for the negotiation attempt, Cale remained standing despite his obvious weakness. He studied Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part curiosity, and part something else that might have been the beginning of respect. "Why?" he asked simply. Rebecca understood that he wasn't asking about her offer to negotiate, but about something deeper. Why she had healed him. Why she cared about his people's survival. Why she was willing to risk everything for strangers who had every reason to hate her. "Because healing isn't just about mending wounds," she said softly. "It's about believing that people can be better than their worst moments, that redemption is possible even after terrible damage has been done. Maybe especially then." Cale said nothing, but Rebecca saw something flicker in his scarred features. Crack in the armor of cynicism that had protected him since his escape from slavery. For just a moment, she glimpsed the man he might have been before torture and loss had transformed him into an instrument of vengeance. Tomorrow, she would walk out of the canyon under a white flag, carrying with her the hopes of 24 Apache families and the fragile possibility that words might prove stronger than weapons. The success or failure of her mission would determine whether the healing that had begun between her and Cale could extend to the larger wounds dividing their peoples. Dawn broke gray and cold over Red Canyon as Rebecca prepared for the most dangerous walk of her life. She had spent the sleepless night crafting arguments that might convince cavalry officers to show mercy to their Apache enemies, knowing that failure would doom everyone she had come to care about in the besieged camp. Tokala handed her a white cloth tied to a wooden pole, the universal symbol of parley that she prayed the soldiers would respect. "Remember," he said grimly, "if they refuse to negotiate or try to use you as a hostage, signal us by dropping the flag. We will create a distraction to cover your return." Rebecca nodded, though they all knew that any distraction would likely trigger the artillery bombardment that would destroy the canyon's defenders. Her mission represented the thin line between survival and catastrophe for 37 Apache souls, including a dozen children who had never harmed anyone. Cale emerged from the medical shelter against her strict orders, his face pale but determined. As he approached the group gathered near the canyon's concealed entrance, his wounds clearly pained him, but his bearing remained that of a war chief whose authority transcended physical weakness. "The soldiers will not expect generosity from Apache," he told Rebecca quietly. "They see us as savage animals who deserve only death. You must make them understand that we are people with families, hopes, fears, that our children dream of growing up just as theirs do." Rebecca studied his scarred features, seeing past the disfigurement to the profound sadness that lived behind his dark eyes. "What if I told them about you? About what you endured, how you survived torture and loss yet still lead your people with honor?" Cale's expression hardened instantly. "My shame is not ammunition for your negotiations. Use whatever arguments you think will work, but leave my past buried where it belongs." The rejection stung, but Rebecca understood the pride that motivated it. Cale had survived by transforming his victimhood into strength, and revealing his vulnerability to enemies would feel like betrayal of everything he had built from the ashes of his former life. "I'll find another way," she promised, then surprised herself by reaching out to squeeze his uninjured hand. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through both of them. A moment of human connection that transcended their roles as captor and captive. Cale stared down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, as if he had forgotten that touch could convey comfort rather than pain. When he looked up again, something fundamental had shifted in his dark eyes. "Come back safely, healer woman," he said softly. "My people... we need you." The admission carried weight beyond its simple words. acknowledging not just her medical skills but her growing importance to him personally. Rebecca felt her heart skip at the implications, recognizing that their relationship had crossed some invisible boundary into territory neither had anticipated. She walked alone through the narrow canyon entrance, her white flag held high as she emerged into the morning sunlight. The cavalry encampment sprawled across the valley floor like a small city, with rows of white tents, picketed horses, and the ominous bulk of the mountain howitzer pointed directly at the canyon mouth. Sentries spotted her immediately, their rifles swinging to track her movement while officers shouted commands across the camp. Rebecca maintained steady pace despite her thundering heart, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger a volley that would end her mission before it began. A mounted patrol intercepted her halfway to the main camp, their leader a grizzled sergeant whose weathered face showed no sympathy for her situation. "Miss, you need to identify yourself and state your business immediately." "I am Rebecca Martinez, a medical practitioner captured during the Cedar Hollow raid," she replied formally. "I come under the flag of truce to speak with your commanding officer about terms for ending this siege." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. Suspiciously, "Apache send their captive to negotiate? That's a new one. You sure they didn't send you out here to spy on our positions?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Sergeant, there are children in that canyon who will die if this standoff continues. I'm trying to find a solution that saves lives on both sides. Surely your commanding officer would want to hear options that might prevent unnecessary casualties." After a tense consultation with his men, the sergeant agreed to escort Rebecca to the command tent. As they rode through the cavalry camp, she observed the preparations for assault ammunition stockpiles, field medical stations, and the grim faces of soldiers preparing for a battle that would likely cost many lives. Colonel Harrison Wade proved to be a lean, sharp-eyed professional whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had preceded his arrival in Texas. He received Rebecca in his command tent with courteous skepticism, clearly intrigued by the unusual circumstances of her visit. "Miss Martinez, I understand you wish to discuss surrender terms for the Apache band in Red Canyon," he said without preamble. "I should inform you that my orders are quite specific. These raiders have terrorized the frontier for months, and Washington demands decisive action." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "Colonel, I've spent nearly 2 weeks among these people as their medical practitioner. While I don't condone their raids, I can attest that they're not the savage monsters depicted in newspaper accounts. Their families trying to survive in a world that has taken everything from them." Colonel Wade's expression remained professionally neutral. "Miss Martinez, with respect, your sympathies appear to have been compromised by your captivity. These Apache have murdered innocent settlers, burned homes, and spread terror throughout the region. Justice demands their punishment." Justice, perhaps, but does it demand the death of children who never participated in any raids? Rebecca pressed. "There are infants in that canyon, Colonel, babies who pose no threat to anyone. Surely military honor doesn't require their destruction." The colonel's facade cracked slightly at her words, revealing the conflict between duty and conscience that plagued any decent officer forced to contemplate such actions. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Martinez?" Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing this moment would determine the fate of everyone she had come to care about. Exile rather than execution. Allow the band to relocate beyond the Rio Grande into Mexico with guarantees they will never return to Texas. In exchange, they surrender all stolen property and provide information about other hostile bands in the region. Colonel Wade considered her proposal silently, his fingers drumming against his field desk as he weighed military necessity against humanitarian concerns. The Apache war chief, this Cale Crow Feather, his reputation is particularly notorious. Washington specifically wants him brought to trial as an example to other raiders. Cale is wounded and may not survive his injuries. Rebecca lied smoothly, hoping to protect him from becoming a particular target. But even if he recovers, exile would remove him as a threat while avoiding the martyrdom that public execution might create among other Apache bands. The negotiation continued for over an hour, with Rebecca carefully presenting arguments that appealed to the colonel's professional pragmatism rather than his emotions. She emphasized the military advantages of a negotiated settlement, reduced casualties, valuable intelligence about other hostile groups, and the propaganda value of showing government mercy toward those who surrendered. Finally, Colonel Wade leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "Miss Martinez, your proposal has merit, but I lack authority to guarantee safe passage into Mexico. Such diplomatic arrangements would require approval from territorial authorities, which could take weeks to obtain." Rebecca felt her heart sink as the reality of bureaucratic limitations threatened to derail her carefully constructed arguments. "Colonel, with respect, those people don't have weeks. The children are already showing signs of malnutrition, and medical supplies are nearly exhausted. Delay equals death sentences for the most vulnerable." The colonel studied her face intently, perhaps recognizing the genuine compassion that motivated her desperate plea. There might be unofficial options. If the Apache were to simply disappear during a carefully timed gap in our patrol coverage, and if certain reports were delayed in reaching my superiors, it's possible they could reach Mexican territory before pursuit could be organized. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she realized he was offering exactly what she had hoped for, a face-saving solution that would allow him to avoid the moral burden of ordering an assault while technically fulfilling his mission to end the Apache threat in Texas. "What would you require in return for such administrative oversights?" she asked carefully. "Complete intelligence about Apache movements in this region, surrender of all stolen property and livestock, and your word that this band will never return to raid in Texas." The colonel's tone remained officially neutral, but Rebecca detected the relief of a man who had found an alternative to actions that violated his personal code of honor. "I believe those terms would be acceptable," Rebecca replied, though she had no authority to negotiate on behalf of the Apache. "When would this gap in patrol coverage occur?" "Tomorrow night, assuming the Apache demonstrate good faith by beginning to return stolen property today." Colonel Wade stood and extended his hand formally. "Miss Martinez, you have given me options I didn't know existed. I pray your influence with these people proves sufficient to prevent the tragedy that would otherwise be unavoidable." As Rebecca walked back toward Red Canyon under her white flag, she carried with her the fragile hope of survival for everyone she had come to love in the Apache camp. But she also bore the tremendous responsibility of convincing proud warriors to accept exile from their ancestral lands as the price of saving their families' lives. The success of her mission would depend entirely on whether Cale Crow Feather could overcome his rage and pride long enough to choose survival over a glorious but pointless death. The war chief who had captured her as a slave now held the power to save or doom his entire people with a single decision. Behind her, the cavalry camp continued its preparations for assault, while ahead lay the canyon where anxious families waited to learn whether words had proven stronger than weapons in the endless cycle of frontier violence. Rebecca's return to the canyon sparked immediate chaos as warriors, women, and children gathered around her, their faces desperate for news that might mean the difference between life and death. She found Cale waiting near the entrance despite his injuries, his dark eyes searching her expression for any hint of hope or despair. "Speak," he commanded quietly, though his voice carried the tension of a man whose world balanced on the edge of a knife. Rebecca looked around at the anxious faces surrounding her warriors who had fought beside their chief, mothers holding children close, elderly people whose wisdom had guided the band through countless previous crises. The weight of their trust and desperation pressed down on her like a physical force. "The colonel has offered terms," she began carefully. "Exile to Mexico in exchange for your lives. But the price is high. You can never return to Texas, and you must surrender all stolen property as proof of good faith." A storm of angry voices erupted from the gathered Apache, warriors shouting protests about abandoning their ancestral lands, while women wept at the thought of leaving sacred burial grounds forever. The emotional turmoil threatened to overwhelm any rational discussion of the offer. Cale raised his hand for silence, his authority cutting through the chaos like a blade. When quiet returned, he spoke with the measured tone of a leader who understood the gravity of the moment. "Tell us everything. What guarantees do we have? What prevents the soldiers from simply hunting us down once we leave the canyon?" Rebecca recounted her conversation with Colonel Wade in detail, explaining the unofficial nature of the arrangement and the narrow window of opportunity it provided. She watched Cale's scarred features carefully as she spoke, seeing the internal struggle between his warrior's pride and his responsibility to protect his people. "This colonel, you believe he will honor his word?" Tokala asked skeptically. "White, soldiers have made many promises to Apache over the years. Most proved worthless when convenience demanded otherwise. I believe he wants to avoid a massacre that would stain his record and conscience," Rebecca replied honestly. "But you're right to be cautious. There are no guarantees except what we create through our own actions." Cale limped closer to her, his injured shoulder clearly causing significant pain despite his efforts to hide weakness. "Mexico offers survival, but not life," he said quietly. "We would be refugees in a land that may prove as hostile as Texas has become. Our children would grow up as strangers to their own heritage." Rebecca felt her heart break at the anguish in his voice. She understood that he was being asked to choose between physical survival and cultural death, a choice no leader should have to make for his people. "There's something else," she said softly, hating herself for adding to his burden. "The colonel specifically mentioned your name, Cale. Your reputation makes you a particular target for justice. If you stay, they'll focus their efforts on capturing you alive for public trial and execution." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone present understood the implications. Cale's presence made the entire band more vulnerable, while his absence might offer them better chances of survival. "Then the choice is simple," Cale said with bitter finality. "I remain to face my fate while the rest flee to Mexico. My death will satisfy their need for vengeance and give my people time to escape." "No," Rebecca said sharply, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "That's not the only option. The colonel doesn't know you've recovered from your injuries. If the band leaves together, you could disappear among the group before anyone realizes you're mobile." Ayana stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face grave with the wisdom of someone who had lived through many crises. "The healer woman speaks the truth. But running to Mexico means abandoning sacred places, burial grounds of our ancestors, hunting territories our grandfathers died defending. Is survival worth such loss?" The question sparked fierce debate among the Apache, with families torn between the desire to live and the pain of leaving everything that defined their identity. Rebecca watched the discussion with growing anxiety, knowing that delay increased the risk of Colonel Wade changing his mind or receiving orders that would eliminate his flexibility. Young mothers holding infants argued for accepting exile, while older warriors spoke passionately about dying with honor on their native soil. The generational divide threatened to fracture the band's unity at the moment when solidarity was most crucial for survival. Cale listened to every voice, his scarred features reflecting the weight of leadership that demanded impossible decisions. Finally, he spoke with quiet authority that cut through the emotional turmoil. "We will vote. Every adult will choose exile or death, survival or honor. But the decision must be unanimous, or we face our enemies divided." The voting process took place in traditional Apache fashion, with each person dropping a colored stone into one of two baskets. White stones represented exile and life, while black stones meant staying to fight and die with honor. Rebecca watched the slow procession of decisions with her heart pounding, knowing that a single dissenting voice could doom them all. The final count revealed 23 votes for exile and only 2 for staying. The dissenting votes came from old warriors whose bodies were too broken for a difficult journey to Mexico, and who preferred to die defending their homeland rather than become burdens on their fleeing families. Honored grandfathers, Cale addressed the 2 elderly men with deep respect. Your courage honors us all. But if you stay, others will remain to care for you, and all will die together. Will you not reconsider for the sake of your grandchildren? The older of the 2 warriors, a man named Cochise, whose hands shook with palsy but whose eyes remained fierce, stepped forward with dignity intact despite his physical frailty. War Chief, I have lived 83 winters and seen our world change beyond recognition. Perhaps it is time for old bones to rest while young hearts seek new beginnings. After much discussion and emotional appeals from their families, both elderly warriors agreed to attempt the journey to Mexico rather than force the entire band into a suicidal last stand. The decision cleared the way for unanimous acceptance of the exile option. As preparations for departure began immediately, Rebecca found herself working alongside Apache women to pack essential supplies and medical materials for the dangerous journey ahead. The logistics were daunting: 37 people, including children and wounded, traveling through hostile territory with limited food and water, pursued by soldiers who might change their minds at any moment. Cale appeared beside her as she organized medical supplies, his presence both comforting and complicated, given the emotions that had been growing between them. You saved us, he said simply. Without your negotiation, we would all be dead by tomorrow night. Rebecca paused in her packing to meet his gaze directly. We're not safe yet. The journey to Mexico will be dangerous, and there's no guarantee. The Mexican authorities will welcome Apache refugees any more than Texas wanted Apache residents. But we have hope now, where this morning we had only the choice between surrender and death. Cale's voice carried a note she had never heard before, something that might have been gratitude mixed with wonder. You gave us a third option when I thought none existed. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent activity near the canyon entrance as scouts reported increased cavalry patrols around the perimeter. Colonel Wade was apparently honoring his agreement to maintain normal surveillance while secretly creating the gap that would allow escape. But the timing would be crucial. As evening approached, Rebecca made final rounds among her patients, checking wounds and dispensing what medication remained for the journey ahead. Nalnish, the young warrior whose broken leg she had set during her first day in camp, approached her with obvious difficulty walking on his healing limb. Healer woman, he said formally, I wish to thank you for saving my leg and my life. But more than that, you saved all our lives by speaking for us to the soldiers. This debt can never be repaid. Rebecca touched his shoulder gently. Your recovery was payment enough. Just promise me you'll be careful on the journey and not push too hard on that leg before it's fully healed. As night fell over Red Canyon, the Apache band made final preparations for their desperate flight to freedom. Children were bundled in warm clothing. Precious possessions were packed onto horses and travois, and warriors checked weapons that might be needed if the escape plan failed. Rebecca found herself standing beside Cale as they watched families saying goodbye to the only home many had ever known. Sacred caves, burial sites, and hunting grounds that had sustained their people for generations would be abandoned forever in exchange for the uncertain promise of survival in a foreign land. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Cale asked, quietly, his scarred profile stark against the firelight. Rebecca considered the question seriously, understanding that he was asking about more than just military tactics. I think we're choosing life over death, hope over despair. Sometimes that's the most courage anyone can show. Cale nodded slowly, then turned to face her fully. When we reach Mexico, assuming we reach Mexico, what will you do? You could claim your freedom, return to your own people. No one would blame you for leaving us after everything you've endured. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had fully acknowledged until that moment. Rebecca realized that somewhere during their time together, the idea of leaving Cale and his people had become almost unthinkable. They needed her medical skills, but more than that, she had found something among the Apache that she had never experienced in the white settlements. A sense of belonging that transcended cultural boundaries. "I haven't decided yet," she replied honestly. "But whatever I choose, I want it to be my choice, not something forced by circumstances or fear." Cale's eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw in them a hope that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Whatever had grown between them during the siege was strong enough to survive the dangerous journey ahead, but fragile enough to be destroyed by the wrong decision at the wrong moment. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or death, but tonight carried the weight of possibilities that neither Rebecca nor Cale had dared to imagine when their relationship began with capture and defiance. The escape began at midnight under a moonless sky that offered both concealment and treacherous footing. As the Apache band crept through the narrow canyon passages toward freedom, Rebecca moved with them like a shadow, her medical bag strapped across her shoulders and her heart hammering against her ribs as they navigated the most dangerous gamble of their lives. Cale led the procession despite his injuries, his intimate knowledge of every rock formation and hidden trail proving invaluable as they wound through terrain that would have been impossible for outsiders to traverse in darkness. Behind him, 36 other souls followed in absolute silence, men, women, children, and elders whose survival depended on avoiding detection until they reached the gap in cavalry patrols that Colonel Wade had promised. The youngest children rode in specially constructed cradle boards that muffled any sounds they might make, while older kids walked between adults who could steady them when exhaustion threatened their balance. Every horse's hooves had been wrapped in thick cloth to deaden their footfalls against stone, and metal objects that might clink or rattle had been secured with leather bindings. Rebecca found herself positioned near the middle of the group, close enough to reach anyone who might need medical attention, but far enough from Cale to avoid distracting him from the complex navigation required. Every few minutes, he would pause to listen for sounds of pursuit or to check landmarks visible only to eyes trained from childhood to read this landscape. 2 hours into their flight, disaster nearly struck when little Sarah Crowfeather Isia's newborn son, who had been born during the siege, began crying from hunger, despite his mother's desperate attempts to quiet him. The infant's wails echoed off the canyon walls with terrifying clarity, potentially alerting any cavalry patrols within a mile radius. Rebecca quickly moved to Isia's side, helping the exhausted young mother find a sheltered spot where she could nurse the baby without exposing the entire group. "Hold him close to your chest," she whispered urgently. "Skin contact will help calm him faster than anything else." Cale appeared beside them, his scarred face tight with concern as he calculated the risks of delay against the danger of discovery. "How long?" he asked quietly. 5 minutes, maybe less," Rebecca replied, watching as Isia's natural maternal instincts combined with her advice to soothe the frightened infant. "But we need to get moving again before—" The distant sound of hoofbeats cut through the night air like a blade, growing steadily louder as mounted cavalry approached their position. Rebecca felt her blood freeze as she realized their worst fear was materializing discovery before they could reach the designated escape corridor. Cale made swift hand signals that sent the other Apache melting into whatever cover the rocky terrain provided. Rebecca pressed herself against a boulder with Isia and her now quiet baby, holding her breath as the sound of horses grew closer. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see torchlight flickering against the canyon walls as soldiers searched for signs of the fleeing band. "Spread out and check every shadow," called a voice she recognized as belonging to the grizzled sergeant who had first intercepted her during negotiations. "Colonel's orders are to maintain normal patrol patterns, but that doesn't mean we ignore obvious sign if we stumble across it." Rebecca's heart sank as she realized the irony of their situation. Colonel Wade's efforts to provide them with escape opportunity were being undermined by his own men's professional competence. The sergeant was simply doing his job, unaware that his thoroughness could doom the very people his commander had secretly agreed to help. The patrol spent 20 agonizing minutes examining the area around their hiding place, sometimes passing within arm's reach of concealed Apache families. Rebecca watched through her rocky shelter as a young cavalry trooper paused directly above, where 2 children lay hidden beneath a ledge, his torch casting dancing shadows that could have revealed their presence with a single wrong movement. Finally, the sergeant called his men back. "Nothing here but old tracks and cold campfires. Let's check the eastern approach before we report back." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the Apache began emerging from their hiding places with the silent efficiency of people whose lives had often depended on such concealment. But the encounter had cost them precious time, and Rebecca could see growing exhaustion in the faces of the elderly and children, who were being pushed beyond their normal limits. Cale gathered his people with quick gestures, making rapid decisions about their remaining route to the Mexican border. Rebecca could tell from his expression that the patrol encounter had forced him to abandon his preferred path in favor of a more direct but exposed route that would minimize their time in cavalry territory. "The next 6 hours will be the most dangerous," he whispered to Rebecca as they prepared to resume their flight. "We must cross open ground where we cannot hide if discovered. After that, the terrain favors us again." Rebecca nodded, checking her medical supplies one final time before they entered the most perilous phase of their journey. She carried herbal stimulants that could help exhausted travelers find reserves of strength, pain medications for those whose injuries made walking agony, and treatment for the cuts and sprains that were inevitable during such desperate travel. As they emerged from the canyon system onto the rolling plains that stretched toward the Rio Grande, Rebecca felt horribly exposed under the star-filled sky. Without the protective walls of stone around them, every member of their group became visible to anyone with decent night vision and high ground for observation. Cale set a punishing pace across the open terrain, knowing that speed now mattered more than stealth. Behind him, the Apache band stretched into a long line of moving shadows, adults carrying children who could no longer walk, elderly members supported by strong arms when their own strength failed. Rebecca found herself helping Ayana, whose arthritis made the forced march a special torment, despite her determination to keep up. The elderly woman's breathing grew labored as they climbed a series of low hills, and Rebecca could feel the trembling in her limbs that signaled approaching collapse. "Rest," Rebecca whispered, but Ayana shook her head firmly. "Cannot stop. Others depend on reaching safety. Old bones will endure or break, but will not slow the young ones." The fierce pride in her voice reminded Rebecca why she had come to respect these people so deeply. Their courage in the face of impossible circumstances exceeded anything she had witnessed among the supposedly civilized settlers of Cedar Hollow. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon with faint gray light, Cale called a brief halt beside a hidden spring that would provide their last reliable water before the final push to the border. Rebecca used the respite to treat various injuries that had accumulated during the night: twisted ankles, scraped hands, and the inevitable cuts from navigating rough terrain in darkness. But her most serious patient was Cale himself, whose wounds had reopened during this strenuous journey. Blood seeped through his shirt from the saber cut across his ribs, and his left shoulder showed signs of renewed inflammation that threatened to incapacitate him when his leadership was most crucial. "You need proper rest," Rebecca said quietly, as she rebandaged his injuries with her dwindling supply of clean cloth. "These wounds could become infected if you keep pushing yourself beyond reasonable limits." Cale's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When my people are safe, I will rest. Not before." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that went far beyond medical advice. Rebecca realized he was telling her about the kind of man he was beneath the scars and reputation for violence, someone who would sacrifice anything, including his own life, for those he had sworn to protect. "What about after?" she asked softly. "When we reach Mexico and your people are safe, what then?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that marked their destination. "I have spent so many years focused on survival, on protecting my people from enemies, that I had forgotten there might be an after. You have reminded me that healing is possible, that wounds can close if given proper care." Rebecca finished tending his bandages, her hands lingering longer than medically necessary on his scarred skin. Some wounds heal better with companionship during the recovery. The admission hung between them like a bridge across the chasm that had once separated captor from captive. In the growing light of dawn, Rebecca could see hope flickering in Cale's dark eyes, not just for survival, but for the possibility of a life that included something beyond constant struggle and loss. Soft whistle from their forward scout interrupted the moment, signaling that it was time to resume their flight. The Rio Grande lay only hours ahead, along with the freedom that Mexico might offer to Apache refugees willing to leave everything behind. But as they prepared for the final push toward safety, Rebecca realized that the most important healing that had taken place during their time together wasn't physical. Somewhere between treating his battle wounds and negotiating for his people's lives, she had helped Cale rediscover his capacity for trust and hope. In return, he had shown her a strength and purpose she had never known existed within herself. The journey to Mexico would determine whether they survived to explore the possibilities growing between them, but the foundation for something deeper than either had expected was already firmly established. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, no longer as captor and captive, but as two people whose souls had been healed by the unexpected power of genuine compassion. The Rio Grande appeared before them like a ribbon of silver in the Vaza afternoon sun, its muddy waters representing the boundary between certain death and uncertain freedom. Rebecca felt tears of relief sting her eyes as she gazed across the river toward Mexico, knowing that 37 Apache lives hung in the balance of the next few hours, but their joy was short-lived. As the exhausted band crested the final hill, overlooking the river, Cale's sharp eyes spotted movement along the far bank. Mexican soldiers in their distinctive uniforms, clearly posted to prevent exactly the kind of border crossing the Apache were attempting. The sight sent a chill through Rebecca's heart as she realized their escape might end in capture by a different army. "How many?" Tokala asked grimly, joining Cale at the observation point. "At least a dozen visible, probably more concealed," Cale replied, his scarred features tight with calculation. "They know Apache refugees have been crossing here. Someone warned them to expect us." Rebecca studied the tactical situation with growing despair. Behind them, American cavalry patrols continued their search, while ahead lay Mexican forces that might prove equally hostile to Apache fugitives. The band was trapped between two armies with nowhere left to run. "There," pointed Ayana, gesturing toward a bend in the river several miles downstream. "Old crossing place where buffalo used to ford in dry seasons. Water runs shallow banks. Are lower. Soldiers maybe not watch there." Cale nodded thoughtfully. The alternative crossing would add dangerous hours to their journey, but it offered their only hope of avoiding detection. "We move immediately. No rest until we reach the other side." The final push toward the Buffalo Crossing tested everyone's remaining reserves of strength and determination. Children who had walked all night now stumbled with exhaustion, while elderly members of the band required constant support to maintain the necessary pace. Rebecca moved continuously through the group, dispensing what little medication remained to ease pain and fatigue. As they approached the river crossing, Rebecca's worst fears materialized. Isaiah, the young mother whose son had been born during the siege, suddenly collapsed beside the trail, her face pale and her breathing labored. A quick examination revealed the symptoms Rebecca had been dreading: childbed fever, a potentially fatal infection that could claim both mother and infant if left untreated. "We cannot stop," Cale said quietly, though his dark eyes reflected the anguish of a leader forced to make impossible choices. "The soldiers will find us if we delay." Rebecca looked down at Isia's fever-bright eyes and the tiny baby who depended on his mother's survival, then back at Cale's tortured expression. In that moment, she understood that true healing sometimes required standing against the tide of practical necessity. "Then you go ahead," she said firmly. "I'll stay with her until the fever breaks, then follow when she's stable enough to travel." The suggestion sparked immediate protests from the other Apache women, who refused to abandon either their healer or the young mother to face death alone. Within minutes, Rebecca found herself surrounded by a circle of fierce female faces declaring their intention to remain behind regardless of the danger. Cale stared at the scene with an expression of wonder and despair. "You would all die for one woman and her child?" "We would all live for one woman and her child," Ayana corrected firmly. "That is what makes us Apache. We do not leave family behind." The deadlock threatened to doom the entire band until young Malnish, whose broken leg Rebecca had healed during her first days in camp, stepped forward with a proposal that changed everything. His knowledge of the local terrain included memory of a hidden cave system near the river crossing, large enough to shelter the entire group while remaining invisible to Mexican patrols. The caves connect to the river through underwater passages, he explained. During flood seasons, they fill completely, but now the water level is low enough to allow access. We could hide there while the healer woman treats Isia, then cross together when it's safe. Cale considered the suggestion with the careful analysis of a military commander weighing risks against benefits. The caves would provide concealment, but also create a trap if discovered. Yet continuing with a seriously ill member of their party was equally dangerous. "Show us," he finally decided. The cave system proved to be a marvel of natural engineering, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that could be easily defended if necessary. Cool water seeped through limestone walls, providing relief from the desert heat, while masking any sounds that might attract attention from the surface. Rebecca established a makeshift medical station in the largest chamber, using her remaining supplies to treat Isia's infection while the rest of the band settled into concealment. The antibacterial properties of certain roots and herbs she had learned from Apache healers proved crucial in fighting the fever that threatened the young mother's life. As she worked through the night, Rebecca became aware of Cale's presence nearby. Despite his own need for rest, he maintained vigil over her medical efforts, ready to assist in any way necessary. Their shared concern for Isia's welfare created an intimacy that went beyond their previous interactions. "You saved my life once," Cale said quietly during a brief break in Rebecca's patient care. "Now you risk everything to save hers. I am beginning to understand why the spirits brought you to us." Rebecca looked up from mixing herbal remedies, meeting his gaze in the flickering light of their carefully shielded fire. "Maybe they brought me to you for the same reason you needed healing, not just from battle wounds, but from wounds that go much deeper." Cale's hand moved unconsciously to his scarred face, then dropped away as if he had caught himself in an unconscious gesture. "Some wounds are too deep for healing. Some damage cannot be undone. The scars will always be there," Rebecca agreed gently, "but scars are proof of survival, not evidence of permanent damage. They show that you endured something terrible and emerged stronger." For a moment, Cale's carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the profound vulnerability that lived beneath his warrior's facade. "My wife said these marks made me a monster, that our children would grow up ashamed of their father's appearance." Rebecca set aside her medical preparations and moved closer, her hands reaching up to trace the burn scars that twisted across his left cheek with infinite gentleness. "Your wife was wrong. These marks show that you are a survivor. A man who refused to be broken, even under the worst circumstances. Any child would be proud to call you father. The simple touch and words of acceptance seemed to shatter some internal barrier that Cale had built around his heart. He leaned into her caress like a man dying of thirst finally finding water, his dark eyes filling with emotions too complex for words. "Rebecca," he whispered, her name carrying weight that transformed it into something sacred. Before either could fully process what was happening, their lips met in a kiss that spoke of healing and hope, of two damaged souls finding completeness in each other's embrace. The kiss deepened as years of isolation and pain gave way to the possibility of genuine connection. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, the air between them charged with possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Rebecca saw in Cale's eyes the same wonder she felt in her own heart, the recognition that something profound had shifted between them. "When we reach safety," Cale said softly, "I want to speak with you about the future. About what might be possible if you choose to stay with us." Rebecca's heart soared at the implications of his words. "What are you asking?" "I am asking if you would consider becoming more than our healer. If you would consider becoming my wife. Sharing leadership of our people as we build new lives in Mexico." The proposal hung between them like a bridge across the chasm that had once separated their worlds. Rebecca realized that accepting would mean abandoning any possibility of returning to white society, embracing a life of uncertainty and hardship. As an Apache leader's wife, but looking into Cale's scarred face, she saw not the feared war chief who had captured her, but the man whose soul she had helped heal through compassion and understanding. The choice between worlds became no choice at all. "Yes," she whispered, sealing their commitment with another kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. Their moment of joy was interrupted by encouraging sounds from Isia, whose fever had finally broken under Rebecca's careful treatment. The fail. Young mother's breathing had steadied, and color was returning to her pale cheeks as the infection yielded to herbal medicines and dedicated nursing care. As dawn broke over the Rio Grande, the Apache band prepared for their final crossing into Mexico. Isia was weak but stable enough for travel, her baby healthy and nursing contentedly. The hidden caves had provided exactly the refuge they needed to survive the most dangerous part of their journey. Cale led his people through the underwater passages that connected the cave system to the river, emerging on the Mexican side under cover of morning mist that concealed their crossing from any watching soldiers. One by one, 37 Apache souls stepped onto foreign soil as free people rather than prisoners or corpses. Standing on the bank of the Rio Grande with Cale's hand in hers, Rebecca looked back toward Texas one final time. Somewhere beyond, the horizon lay Cedar Hollow, where her old life as a frontier healer had ended with capture and fear. But here beside the muddy waters that had carried them to safety, a new life was beginning, one that would blend her medical knowledge with Apache traditions, her healing skills with the love of a man whose scars had become beautiful to her eyes. The journey ahead would bring new challenges as they established themselves in Mexico, built relationships with local authorities, and created a sustainable community for Apache refugees. But Rebecca faced those uncertainties with confidence, born of having witnessed the incredible strength and resilience of her adopted people. As the band moved away from the river toward the mountains of Mexico, Rebecca realized that the most profound healing of all had taken place within her own heart. She had begun this journey as a captive, but she would complete it as a willing participant in a love story that transcended every boundary of race, culture, and expectation. The Apache raider who had captured her to sell as a slave had indeed conquered her soul, not through force or fear, but through the gradual revelation of his own wounded humanity and the healing power of genuine compassion. In saving his life and his people, Rebecca had discovered a purpose and love that would define the rest of her days. Behind them, The Rio Grande flowed on toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying away the old life while blessing the new one that had begun with a kiss in a hidden cave and a promise of shared tomorrows in a land where healing could finally flourish without the shadow of war. 3 months after crossing the Rio Grande, Rebecca stood atop a limestone ridge overlooking the settlement that had become their new home in the mountains of Coahuila. Below her, Apache wickiups dotted a fertile valley where clear streams provided water year-round and natural caves offered protection from both weather and potential enemies. The transformation from desperate refugees to thriving community had exceeded even her most optimistic hopes. The morning air carried the sounds of children playing Apache games, women grinding corn with traditional stone metates, and men working together to construct permanent dwellings that blended Apache techniques with Mexican materials. Most remarkably, the laughter she heard held no trace of the fear and desperation that had marked their flight from Texas. "You look thoughtful this morning." Cale's voice came from behind her, warm with the affection that had grown between them during their months of building a new life together. Rebecca turned to find her husband approaching with the confident stride that had replaced his former defensive posture. The scars that covered his face and neck remained as visible as ever, but they no longer dominated his appearance. Instead, they had become part of a face that radiated contentment and purpose in ways that transcended physical imperfection. "I was thinking about how far we've all traveled," she replied, moving into the circle of his arms. "Not just the distance from Texas, but the journey from who we were to who we've become." Cale nodded, understanding her meaning perfectly. Their transformation had been as dramatic as that of their entire community. The feared war chief and captured healer had evolved into respected leaders of a peaceful settlement that served as a model for successful Apache integration into Mexican society. "Tocala brought news from the town this morning," Cale said, his voice carrying a note of excitement she had learned to recognize. "The Mexican governor wants to expand our arrangement to welcome other Apache bands seeking refuge from American expansion. He's offering official recognition of our settlement as an autonomous territory." Rebecca felt her heart leap at the implications. Official recognition would provide security and legitimacy that could transform their fragile experiment into a permanent sanctuary for Apache people displaced by the ongoing conflicts across the border. It would also validate the healing model they had developed, one that emphasized integration without forced assimilation. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "That we would consider it carefully, but only if we maintain control over who settles here and how the community develops." Cale's tone carried the wisdom of a leader who had learned to balance opportunity against the need to protect his people's cultural identity. "We've built something special here, something worth preserving." Their settlement had indeed become remarkable. Under Rebecca's medical guidance and Cale's leadership, they established the first Apache community to successfully blend traditional healing practices with modern medicine. The combination had proven so effective that Mexican officials regularly sent difficult cases to them for treatment, creating goodwill that had smoothed their integration into the region. More importantly, they had created a place where Apache children could grow up learning both their ancestral traditions and the skills needed to navigate the changing world around them. Rebecca had established a school that taught reading and writing alongside Apache history and customs, while Cale organized hunting and warrior training that emphasized protection rather than raiding. "There's something else," Cale continued, his eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Santiago arrived from Mexico City yesterday with a proposal I think you'll find interesting." Dr. Alejandro Santiago had become an unexpected ally after visiting their settlement to investigate reports of their medical success. The elderly physician had been so impressed by their healing methods that he had spent 2 weeks learning Apache herbal techniques before returning to the capital with glowing reports. "He wants to establish a formal medical school here," Cale revealed. a place where Mexican doctors can learn Apache healing traditions while Apache healers study modern surgical techniques. He's already secured funding from the university and government backing. Rebecca stared at her husband in amazement. The proposal represented everything she had dreamed of but never dared. Hope for official recognition of Apache medical knowledge as valuable science rather than primitive superstition, combined with opportunities to advance healing practices for everyone. It would make you the first woman to hold a formal teaching position at a Mexican medical institution, Cale added with obvious pride. Dr. Santiago insists that your experience bridging both traditions makes you uniquely qualified to lead such a program. The magnitude of the opportunity overwhelmed Rebecca temporarily. From captured slave to respected medical educator represented a journey that would have been impossible to imagine during those terrifying first days in Red Canyon. Yet every step had led naturally to this moment. Each challenge overcome had prepared her for greater responsibilities. "What about you?" she asked. "What role would you play in this expanded settlement?" Cale's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the future they were being offered. Dr. Santiago suggested that Apache administrative traditions might offer alternatives to Mexican bureaucratic systems. "He wants me to work with the territorial government to develop new approaches to Native relations based on cooperation rather than subjugation." Rebecca realized they were being offered the chance to become pioneers in a completely different kind of frontier, one where healing and diplomacy replaced violence and conquest as the primary tools for building relationships between cultures. The irony wasn't lost on her that the Apache raider, who had once epitomized frontier violence, might become a model for peaceful coexistence. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Miguel Santos, one of several Mexican children, whose families had moved to the settlement after witnessing the effectiveness of Apache healing methods. The boy's bright eyes and easy mixing of Spanish and Apache phrases in his speech represented the kind of cultural blending that gave Rebecca hope for the future. "Senora Rebecca," he called breathlessly, "Ayana says you must come quickly. The new baby is coming, and something is wrong." Rebecca immediately shifted into medical mode, gathering her supplies while Cale organized assistance for whatever emergency awaited. As they hurried toward the birthing wickiup, Rebecca reflected on how natural it had become to respond to medical crises, alongside her Apache family and Mexican neighbors who had joined their community. Inside the shelter, they found Consuela Herrera, a Mexican woman whose husband managed mining operations in the nearby hills, in the midst of a difficult breech delivery. Ayana and the other Apache midwives had done everything possible, but the baby's position required surgical intervention that only Rebecca's training could provide. Working with calm efficiency that had become second nature during her months of blending medical traditions, Rebecca successfully repositioned the infant and guided him safely into the world. The healthy cries that filled the wickiup brought tears of relief to everyone present, including Cale, whose emotional investment in every community member's welfare had become one of his most endearing characteristics. "Another son for our village," Ayana announced with satisfaction, using the Apache word that had come to encompass both ethnic groups living in their settlement. "The children grow strong when Apache and Mexican wisdom work together." As Rebecca cleaned the newborn and ensured Consuela's recovery, she was struck by the symbolic significance of the moment. This child would grow up in a world where Apache and Mexican traditions were equally valued, where healing transcended cultural boundaries, and where former enemies had become family. Later that evening, as the community gathered for the naming ceremony that would welcome the new baby into their extended family, Rebecca found herself overwhelmed by the depth of transformation that had occurred. Around the ceremonial fire, Apache elders sat beside Mexican settlers, sharing stories and passing down wisdom to children who belonged to both cultures and neither. Cale rose to speak as the fire burned low, his scarred face noble in the flickering light as he addressed the assembled families. Tonight we welcome another child into our community, but we also celebrate something larger. We have proven that people of different backgrounds can not only live together peacefully, but can create something stronger than either culture could achieve alone. His words carried across the gathering with the authority of someone who had earned respect through service rather than fear. Rebecca watched faces around the fire: Apache warriors who had learned to build rather than raid, Mexican settlers who had discovered the value of native wisdom, children who would never know the hatred that had once divided their peoples. 3 seasons ago, we came to this valley as refugees fleeing destruction, Kale continued. Tonight, we gather as builders of a new kind of community, one that proves healing is more powerful than hatred, that cooperation can triumph over conquest. As the ceremony concluded with traditional blessings offered in both Apache and Spanish, Rebecca felt a deep sense of completion wash over her. The journey that had begun with her capture during the Cedar Hollow raid had led to something beyond her wildest imagination, a place where healing skills could flourish without the constant threat of violence, where love had transformed enemies into family. Walking back to their own dwelling under a canopy of desert stars, Rebecca and Kale discussed the momentous decisions awaiting them. The medical school opportunity represented a chance to influence healing practices across Mexico and perhaps beyond, while the territorial autonomy offer could establish their settlement as a model for peaceful native relations throughout the Americas. Whatever we decide, Kale said as they reached their doorway, we decide together. The days when I made choices alone are over. Rebecca smiled at the evolution reflected in his words. The autocratic war chief, who had once ruled through fear and intimidation, had become a partner who valued collaboration and shared decision-making. Their marriage had healed more than personal wounds. It had demonstrated the possibility of transformation, even for those who seemed irredeemably hardened by trauma. Inside their home, surrounded by objects that blended Apache craftsmanship with Mexican artistry, Rebecca began planning for the future with the same careful attention to detail that had once marked her medical preparations. But now her plans encompassed not just individual healing, but the wellness of an entire community that had become proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to embrace change. As she drifted off to sleep in Kale's arms, Rebecca reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought them to this moment. The Apache raider who had captured her as a slave had indeed conquered her soul, not through force, but through the gradual revelation of his capacity for growth, love, and leadership. In healing his wounds, she had discovered her own true calling as a bridge between worlds that had once seemed permanently divided. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Rebecca faced them with confidence born of having witnessed the transformative power of compassion applied with courage and persistence. The settlement in the Coahuila Mountains stood as living testimony that even the deepest wounds could heal when treated with patience, understanding, and love. The story that had begun with violence and capture had become an epic of healing and hope, proving that the human capacity for redemption could overcome any obstacle when guided by the simple recognition that all people, regardless of their scars or past mistakes, deserve the chance to become better than their worst moments. In the end, the greatest healing had not been physical wounds closing or even psychological trauma resolving, but the transformation of hatred into love, of conquest into cooperation, and of two damaged souls into a partnership that would spend their remaining years proving that peace was always possible for those brave enough to choose it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.